And now, welcome our panelists and moderator.
Okay, so we've had a little bit of a brief history of AI from Tommy. And I just want to add to that in that the concept of machine intelligence came about with Alan Turing in the 1940s. And as Tommy said, in the 1950s, we coined the term artificial intelligence. And most people haven't really seen AI impacting their lives until today. But there's been a lot of research been going out there, even self-driving cars and EVs. They started in the 1920s. But something has been happening recently in the last decade where artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics is really getting part of our everyday lives. We all talk to Siri and Alexa. We all use Google and Amazon. And now things are getting into the workplace, and the future of work is changing. So this is what the panel is going to be discussing today: how we can lead those changes with this new industrial revolution. And I'm going to start with robots, because we've been playing around with the robots during the lunch break. So I'm going to start with Niluka. Sobeys have done an amazing journey into using robotics and automation. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I've been reading about 4 robotics distribution centers, 750,000 square feet,
Yep.
with robots going up and down 75-foot high piles of stacked products for 20 hours a day, and one robot is now doing the work of 4 employees. So please tell us about Sobeys' implementation and the challenges and what you've learned from that.
Well, number one is definitely a massive team effort. So we actually started thinking about automating our warehouses probably, well, almost 15 years ago now. We were already starting to run into issues, and as you all probably know, in any business situation, you're asked to do more with less. So we were already starting to reach the point where our warehouses were reaching capacity. We were having trouble with labor. So if you could imagine, you have an 18-year-old working in a freezer throughout his summer, and you're asking him to work Friday, Saturday, and Sunday through the whole summer in a freezer as opposed to being outside. So we had massive turnover happening. We had, at that time, a prediction of probably 50 to 70% more items coming into the warehouses over the next 5 years. So we knew we had a serious problem to solve. And one of the biggest issues was moving product efficiently through those warehouses. So if you have a full pallet of cereal or a full order of cereal that comes in, and it's cereal from one supplier, and it comes in the warehouse and it goes out, no problem. It's when you have to start picking and packing and changing, and so that was all done manually. Our warehouses are obviously quite big. There's only so much land. You can't just expand them vastly across. So that's why you're starting to see the vertical integration as opposed to going across horizontally. Critical piece for us was to get leadership on board. So the 4 warehouses that you're talking about right now, that cost us about $600 million in capital. So you have to build quite the business case to have that happen. So we ended up, we did all of the analysis. Our leaders got on board very early, which was critical. So they were driving the decisions, and they were driving the capital spend. And we also calculated that it would be about 50 cents per case savings. And 50 cents doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you have a warehouse that moves 40 to 70 million cases a year, it adds up significantly. So obviously we're getting the return in savings. And the robots are very, very intelligent. So we have a partner, Witron. They're based in Germany. And one of the critical pieces of being successful in this area was knowing what we didn't know and knowing what we do know. We know our customers, we know our business. We had no idea, nor do we ever claim to know about software development or robots or how to build that or how to run it. So Witron had a fully integrated solution. They could come in, they could partner with us. It was all of their software, all of their equipment, all of their expertise that built our warehouses and drove all of that efficiency. And as we're moving in more and more into the e-commerce space, which is very exciting for us because grocery has been very traditional for a very long time, and we're now getting disrupted, and so everybody has to get into the e-commerce space. Our strategy was not just to sort of catch up or keep up with our competitors. We wanted to leapfrog and to win. So that's our new partnership with Ocado that's based out of England. And they are a fully online grocer. That's all they do. They're highly efficient at it, and they're very profitable at it, which is different than our leading competitor in e-commerce, that's Amazon in grocery. So, our CEO will publicly say that our strategy for e-commerce has been that there will be two main players in the e-commerce world e-commerce world in Canada over the next couple of years, and it'll be Sobeys and Amazon. So we're positioning ourselves. It has to be long-term thinking. You have to be committed to it, and you have to know that it's going to be some heavy lifting in the beginning. And picking the right partner that balances your skill set has been critical for us.
And heavy lifting, that wasn't a pun.
That was a pun, but nobody got it. It's all good. No, it wasn't.
So what were the main challenges that were faced? Because this is clearly a major technological change.
The capital investment, the builds. So even with Ocado, our first customer fulfillment center, we're building one with them. It will take a couple years to build. So that time frame and that investment is a big challenge. I would say the biggest piece of it is the human factor. So as you bring robots into an organization and you drive efficiency, you are obviously reducing the number of jobs that are available. And so we have worked through that when we did automation. We worked through that recently over the past year. I don't know if you've heard about it in the news, but we did a massive reorganization and restructure at Sobeys. And our rule is always that we try to treat everybody with fairness and make sure everybody feels respected. So your leadership has to be brave enough and bold enough to understand that the changes that you're making in the organization are going to drive savings and they're going to drive efficiencies. So you need to invest even in how you exit people. You're affecting their lives, you're impacting their livelihoods, their families. So we're very conscious of that. And so the packages that were provided and how our HR team handled everything, and we brought in counselors, career coaches, et cetera, et cetera. And the real message was that, for our warehouses, for example, instead of now lifting boxes and driving a forklift and, doing very physical work, it's more thinking work, it's more brain work, it's elevating the roles that remain in the organization so that they feel like they're driving much more value than they were in the past.
And Carol, there's a lot of legal implications to these changes. And if anyone hasn't already done so, please download, the book that on, was it chatbots and self-driving cars and the AI and legal implications. It's got all the basics of AI and a lot of legal implications where you wouldn't think there were legal implications. So can you speak to the legal challenges that you're finding companies are dealing with when they make these major changes?
So we look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is that of the law. How will the law change, if at all, because of artificial intelligence? So let me just contextualize this for you for a second. The law is really around human intervention. So it is, what has somebody done or failed to do, and what harm has that caused? And that becomes a really interesting question when the creator of a system has created something that is ultimately more independent and ultimately affecting actions that may cause a harm. Harm is defined quite broadly, but it causes some harm that the original creator of that system could not have foreseen and didn't influence. And so increasingly, so think about the self-driving car, for instance. There is a lot of question around, do we need a separate liability regime because the originator of the car or the manufacturer of the car and the manufacturer of the system may not be able to fully anticipate or program or delineate actions that the car will take? That's really interesting from a liability perspective, and that raises really, from my perspective, cool questions about the law. So how will the law change, if at all? I think it will. I think in time we will see that we need new regulations, we need to sort of rethink some of our first principles as we particularly look at questions of liability. That's not yet, but I think that's to come as systems become more sophisticated and ultimately more independent. Then there's the question of, well, how does AI actually affect the practice of law? And the way AI affects the practice of law is very much along the lines of what you'll hear, which is the work that is done that is more routine, that is more mundane, that doesn't really require that higher level thinking, that in time will be more automatable. And what lawyers will ultimately do is focus much more on the higher value work, which is the application of judgment and, frankly, the relationships with their clients. The white paper that you referenced, From Chatbots to Self-Driving Cars, what we did is we did two things. We really tried to apply sort of a legal definition, a legal perspective on this question of what is AI. And the reason we did this is because, so I'm a litigator by training, so my job is either to bring a lawsuit or defend a lawsuit. And when I was looking at certain use cases, I kept thinking, how would I characterize this system? Like, what regime would be most useful to my client, assuming I'm defending? Do I want this situated as a product liability issue? Do I want this situated as a tort issue? Do I want this situated as a contract issue? And there are different implications depending on how you characterize it. Now, in some cases, the facts will characterize it for you, so you don't get that opportunity. But in some cases, maybe not. So we applied that thinking to what is AI. And then we looked at different areas of law, and we thought, where do we think AI will have an immediate impact, and where do we think it will have a slightly longer-term impact? And so we looked at issues of privacy and data. We looked at IP, intellectual property, and really there, what you're talking about is who owns the intellectual property when it's created? Are certain algorithms patentable, which is a question that often comes up. Can you copyright a creation that is created by an AI system where there has been no human intervention, which is typically a requirement? We looked at issues of employment law. We looked at competition law, which was actually quite interesting to figure out if you're the holder of a lot of data and you then merge with another company that is a holder of a lot of data, do you become a little bit of a data monopoly because that thing you hold is so valuable from a competitive perspective? And then, of course, we looked at contract and tort. So what are the legal implications? Today, I would say primarily in data and IP. But in time, I think you'll see that change.
So what we can see here is that what Sobeys has done is make some fundamental infrastructure changes. And we've talked about some of the nuances of AI and the difficulties of how it fits into the existing legal system and how that may need to change. So Tiff, what do companies and businesses have to do in today's new economy to deal with these changes?
Well, wonderful to be on this panel, and my co-panelists are actually doing it. So I'm the dean of a business school. I'm going to give you the theory. They're going to tell you how to really do it. So we about 3 or 4 years ago, we actually started spending a lot of time on AI from a business perspective. What does AI do? And the very practical reason we did that is one thing we could see is that actually from a research standpoint, Canada is actually a leader in artificial intelligence. Jeff Hinton at U of T, Joshua Benjo at University of Montreal, there's one other person at University of Edmonton, blank for a second. I mean, these people have been absolute leaders in deep learning and reinforcement learning. But what we could see, as is so often the case in Canada, great Canadian science is commercialized and the economic benefits accrete to Silicon Valley. And so we can't let this tragedy happen again. We need to engage, we need to help these people who want to start businesses here in Canada do that, and we need to engage the business community. So what does AI do for a business? Well, and a number of my colleagues, Ajay Agrawal being the real leader, have really driven this. What does AI do? It dramatically drops the cost of prediction. And in that sense, it's a platform technology. It's, another great U of T invention is insulin. Insulin is an amazing invention, saved the lives of millions of people. But it's not a platform technology in the way AI is. So when you think of platform technologies, trains dramatically drops the cost of transportation. Computers dramatically drop the cost of arithmetic. The internet dramatically dropped the cost of, again, communication and particularly data transfer. AI dramatically drops the cost of prediction. Another one that's getting a lot of attention, blockchain. What does blockchain do? It dramatically drops the cost of verification. So from a business perspective, if you're thinking, okay, AI, it's everywhere. Every time I pick up the newspaper, AI, I need some AI in my company. But what do we do with it? Well, I think the first thing to do is, okay, think about what are some pain points you have in your company where a big important piece of that is prediction. Prediction doesn't have to be the whole bit. And in fact, in most business problems, they're not purely a prediction problem. But prediction may be an important part of the problem. And then, what leading businesses have been doing is, so they find these pain points, they see that it's a prediction problem. So, if you're a bank, for example, what loans are going to get paid back and what loans are unlikely to get paid back? What customers are suspicious? What customers are good people? These are prediction problems. And these are pain points for banks. So get the step one is get some data organized, get a use case, and bring in some computer science experts, some AI experts, and let's see if you can get a good prediction. That's step one. And many companies have now done that. And I was joking with my panelists before, in many respects, the technology people won't tell you that, but I think the business people will say, well, that's the easy part. The next part is, okay, now we need to actually integrate this into our company. And that's sort of what's going on now. And that requires, you don't just need the test data, you need the data to keep improving this thing and keep training it. So you need a whole bunch of data governance. And this isn't, we think of data, we think of numbers. Well, AI does deal with numbers, but it deals with lots of unstructured data too. So there's all kinds of other sorts of information that you can bring to bear. And the better the data you put in, the cleaner the data, the higher the quality, the better the prediction. So that's kind of Mach 1 from a business perspective. But let me just sort of hint at what Mach 2 might look like. So mostly what you're seeing today in business in bringing AI in is, this is a tool that allows you to do stuff faster, cheaper, better. And when you look at other, platform technologies, take computers, dramatically drop the cost of arithmetic. So, what were the early applications? Well, anything that involved a lot of arithmetic. I mean, the first things were, sending orbits around the Earth or the Moon. Then, in the business world, spreadsheets. All of a sudden, great innovation. But then people started thinking, well, wait a second, there's some other problems. Now that arithmetic is so cheap, why don't we convert taking pictures from a chemical process to a digital one? So all of a sudden, all the pictures we take now are digital. We're taking more pictures than we've ever taken before. And Kodak is bankrupt. Music's gone digital. All sorts. So there's whole new business models. And then you combine that with say your smartphone, and you've got say Uber. Uber wasn't possible until you had a smartphone and everybody had GPS in their pocket. So we're just sort of on the. I would say we're not there yet. What are the big applications of AI? So far, as you said, there's lots of kind of cool things we're using. Businesses are using it to drive down costs and drive efficiency. The next wave will be some new business models that basically whole new ways to do things, whole new products, whole new markets.
So you made some major changes there with robots. There's a lot of fear-mongering about AI, and robots seem to be the personification of that at the moment. So robots are taking our jobs. This is a scary prospect for many, many people. How did you deal with, potential fear of employees? And how did you ensure that they could work and felt comfortable working with their co-robots, or cobots as they're now called?
I think there's sort of two pieces to that. So there is sort of fear mongering or fear that isn't justified, and then there is justifiable fear as well. So in reality, robots will replace a lot of more administrative, more physical roles in business. But as business leaders, you also have to be brave enough to recognize that if you don't change and you don't keep up with the times, then you're just going to disappear as an organization. And my boss, Lynn Castonguay, will often talk about, if the rate of change outside of your organization is going faster than the rate inside, then the end is near. And she also talks about, as we were reorganizing and getting ready to make some major, major changes in our business, even at the time of robotics, if you look at organizations that haven't been brave enough to do that, they truly don't exist anymore. So you mentioned Kodak. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera back in the 1970s, I believe. And they didn't move forward with it because it was going to cannibalize and take away from their print photo business. Blockbuster, another one Lynn talks about is Blockbuster. They had the opportunity to buy Netflix. Didn't do it. I think for like $50 million back then. You think about what they're worth now, and that Netflix has taken over and Blockbuster no longer exists. So as a large organization or as a business, you have to recognize the change and the pace of things that are going on around you, and you have to be brave enough to make those decisions. And as we were going through our major changes recently, it was more about explaining the case for change and making sure that everybody understood that. So our change management team was absolutely critical in that. Our communications team was absolutely critical in that. And how you treat people throughout all of that change is what's going to make you successful. Because that is the reality. Robots are replacing jobs, but they're also enabling very different, more value-added jobs to be created in every industry and every market that they come into.
So Tiff, leadership. Are the skills of leadership going to be changing?
Yes, and just sort of build on your answer, I agree with everything you said. I think, to give I don't want to diminish the human impact that AI is going to have on our companies, our society. But I also think this is not the first time in history we've had a new platform technology come in. And what we see through history is, yes, there is definitely disruption, but there are also whole new job categories are created. And if you think, just to give you a sort of we all go to the doctor, we all know a little bit about health. So AI in the health world, it's a predictive machine, and when you go to the doctor and you have something wrong, the doctor has to predict what's wrong with you. They need to give you a diagnosis. So, AI is going to create much faster, much cheaper, much more ubiquitous diagnosis. I mean, for example, one of the ventures I've seen is, I've got a spot on my hand, you take a picture of that. Is that an age spot or is that a melanoma? It will tell me. I don't have to go to the doctor. So what does that mean? You're going to get a lot more diagnosis. So that part of the business, there probably will be some job loss. But once you have a diagnosis, somebody has to take a judgment. Okay, now we've got a diagnosis. Now there's four different treatments. What would be the best treatment for you? AI might be helpful there too, because maybe you have customized medicine and the AI helps you on that too. But then somebody's going to have to give the treatment. So that part of the business is probably, if we have a lot more diagnosis and it's a lot cheaper, we're probably going to need a lot more treatment. So that's just a simple example where there is going to create more demand. So you want to think about as you think about these jobs, what are the things that are highly complementary to AI? Those are going to be the areas that are going to grow. And then what things are sort of substitutable for AI, those are where the job losses are going to be. I would say, as a general comment in terms of, how we're training people, I would say that it has to be more interdisciplinary. Technology has to be really built into, if you're learning finance or accounting, we still need people that understand finance, accounting, or law, but they need to be much more tech savvy in terms of, finance and technology are interacting in a huge way. So you don't need to be the person who's doing the coding, but they need to understand what the technology is going to do. And then I agree entirely, there's a huge human element. Increasingly, problems require a broader mix of skill sets. And so you need people who can work together. A problem is not an accounting problem or a finance problem, it's a business problem, and that probably needs a lawyer, a technologist, a developer person, a customer relations person. And so the ability to bring those skills together and work together, I think, will be even more important.
And as we've seen with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, data and privacy issues are really key to individuals. I have an AI company, we have data, and I'm having my customers say, hey, what are you going to do with your data? And we try not to take people's data. We try to do AI without taking their data, without storing it, which is hard. What's changing now in the legal world with data and privacy concerns, and what do companies really need to bear in mind in this new economy?
So I think the biggest change really comes from Europe. So the European general data privacy regulations came into effect May 25th. And that is setting a new bar for companies that are accessing and storing data. So I think it depends, first of all, where you are. So where you are in the world. China has been very clear that they have an aggressive strategy in place to be the leader in AI by 2025. And the privacy policies and legislation in China are very different than what you have here, and are very different than what you have in the US, and are very different than what you have in the EU. Yet we live in a global world where data is accessed, it's given in one point, it's accessed in another, it's stored in another. So we have a very global world, which is why I say that the big change, I think, is the GDPR and the expectations around GDPR. But I want to pick up on the idea of the prediction, lowering the cost of prediction, which I think is very much related to this concept of, how do we protect data and what do we do with such data? And it is in being thoughtful about the type of prediction as a company that you're making, depending on what type of business you're in. So remember that AI is analyzing vast amounts of data that is historic data. And that historic data is reflective of the last 5 years, the last 10 years, whatever your period is. And that historic data has to be analyzed carefully, because we need to be mindful that the way we were 10 years ago may not be the way we want to be now, or the way we are now, or the way we want to be in the future. And so we need to be very conscious, and there's a lot of discussion these days around data ethics and around bias in sort of algorithmic outputs or AI outputs, because of this concern that we are using past data to make future predictions, and that data set may not be reflective of the type of future we want. So I'll give you a very simple example. I'll cannibalize my own industry because it's only fair. But if we look at the participation of women in law, for instance, particularly at higher levels of law, if you're going to be relying on the last 10, 20 years of data to make predictions on who would make a stellar lawyer in the future, your data set may not be reflective of the women that you want to be incorporating in the future, because they may not be there. They may not have been given those opportunities then. So we need to be very mindful, and there are a lot of studies around this. There are studies around the use of AI in the criminal justice system, particularly in the US, and the impact on different categories of defendants and different classes of defendants. And you need to be very conscious of what that looks like as you use AI to make future predictions.
Okay, so we are going to go to Q&A now. So you've got 3 leading experts in 3 different areas. So please ask your questions. We got a question here.
Excuse me, sorry. Thank you. Great discussion. Carol, you mentioned, I just want to piggyback on the use of AI and diversity and inclusion. Because if we don't have the data, how do we ensure that we have the right mix or skill sets of people, and what do organizations need to do to ensure that we're really creating an inclusive future?
Yeah, so I honestly think this is a very important issue, because what you don't want to do is perpetuate discrimination and bias going forward. We want the systems that we use. Again, it's depending on your circumstance. If you're pulling, cereal off a shelf, it's not quite the same thing as if you're making recruitment decisions, which no doubt Sobeys would do, I assume, you use as well. So AI is being used in a lot of sort of regular operational tasks, and it's also being used in sensitive tasks that I think have an important bearing on people's lives. The issue of the question of the credit and access to mortgage are important considerations. So what do? I mean, you have to be mindful of the data set that you have, and I think there's a discussion that needs to be required around what does our data set look like and where do we think there are gaps. So in some cases, you can account for those gaps, and in some cases, you can't. And if you can't, then at least there is an acknowledgement that there is this gap. And so the application of human judgment in using that output can be mindful of the gap, which is why this idea of having a data ethics framework is increasingly becoming popular in certain industries, particularly those that are highly regulated, because there is desire to want to be able to explain and understand and analyze the data set and then do the same for the outputs of the system.
Yeah, I would just add that, exactly as you said, if you just use the AI to train on existing data, it may just include the same biases that are in the data. And so that is something that we have to be mindful of. But giving an analogy to driverless cars. So AI, works on the driverless car by not learning mechanically how to drive a car. It learns how would a human drive a car. But actually, humans have lots of biases in the way we drive cars. If we see a yellow light, we think, oh, that I should speed up, as opposed to I should, if you'd read the rule, it was like, no, actually, you're supposed to slow down and be cautious. We don't always check our blind spot. So what you do is then you go in and you start by having the AI learn how they mimicking a human, but then you can actually make the AI better than the human. The other thing is AI, actually, I've seen some applications where AI is used actually to try to search for unintended biases. So I've seen an AI company so you want to recruit some people into your company. The AI algorithm will look at your job application and tell you if there are some inherent gender biases built into your application, so you become aware of them. The whole thing about inherent biases is we don't think we're biased, but we are. But the AI algorithm points them out.
Yeah, and that's one of the good things about AI is we see all these, the biases are being encoded into the algorithms, but AI is also very good at reflecting who we are as human beings. So if we can actually use that to address those issues and not always see the bias that's coming out of the algorithms, as long as we're actually addressing it and understanding that is part of who we are and understanding our biases and being able to deal with that. So we have a question at the front here.
How's it going, everybody? I'm Zach from the States. Pleasure to be here. So my question is for anyone open. Can you explain the difference in your guys' eyes, what the difference is between AI, machine learning, and is one a subset of the other, or is it a Venn diagram? Kind of what are the differences between those two words, in your words? Thank you.
I can start. I mean, I've spent some time sitting down with, so as a litigator, my whole thing is I need to understand the steps. Like I need to understand what does this all mean. And so the way I think of AI, I think of it as a big bubble, like a big umbrella term. And there are lots of things that fall under it, whether justifiably or not. And so I often hear of machine learning and AI, but in my mind, machine learning falls under the umbrella of AI, as does natural language processing, as does image recognition. So I sort of think of it that way. I'm not sure that's right. That's just how I think of it.
I'd absolutely agree with that. And I would also say that you got to think about both and all the other terms that are coming out in the industry now, and sort of surround all of that with the human element. So people are going to interpret things differently, and they're going to, whether you think this is the definition of something and that's the definition of something else, everyone's going to interpret differently. So it's really got to be a conversation about the problem you're trying to solve and what's the best technology that can balance out the human element and leverage the technology to make it better.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's a variety of terms. AI is sort of the umbrella term. The one thing I would say, though, from a business perspective is, so if you think of AI as a prediction machine, so we've had prediction tools for a long time. There's lots of statistical tools, regression being the most common one, and there's very more sophisticated versions of regression. And so one thing lots of providers will say, because AI is now the thing. So we'll say, well, this is AI. Well, you do have to look under the hood. Exactly when thing across from a sort of a classical prediction to an AI is, there's a bit of a gray zone in there. But the fundamental feature that is different about AI is that the algorithm is actually learning. It's not just predicting.
Yes, I mean, artificial intelligence is, we're trying to make machines do things that in humans would require intelligence. And I'd also add that, in doing that, we actually learn more about what it is to be human as well. AI often is, on social media, seen as being some kind of sentient system, the AI. There is nothing that is sentient at the moment. And I think, as Carol said, there are many techniques that fall within the definition of AI.
Hey, I've got a question, guys. So you know what? It's really funny how you guys were talking about artificial intelligence and talent acquisition, because we're an AI startup based out of Toronto, and we're called Knockery, and essentially we assess soft skill through video of candidates. And and Carol, I've got a question for you. So initially we had to really sit down and explain to legal about our data set and the representation and the steps that we've taken to diminish unconscious bias. But without them understanding, it took a very long time. So from your standpoint, do you think that there is going to be an ethical framework in place, and that is going to help younger companies sell quicker?
Right. I think I think individual companies, particularly larger companies, are going to lead the way in creating ethical standards. We see this a little bit more happening in the U.S., where the companies themselves are taking the initiative because it's not government-led. So I spoke to one large, highly regulated company that essentially the quip was, we want to have a transparency framework, but we just don't know what the bar is, because we don't know what transparency looks like in the US versus Canada versus Europe. We don't know if it's all the same, the expectations are all the same, or they're all different. And this is something like transparency and the ability to have some interpretation of the system's output, I think is very important. I do think it's a policy discussion. I do think that at some point the government is going, or governments will start to weigh in. It's certainly something that's been discussed by government before, but I don't think it will be something that is government-led. I think it will be something that is industry-led. And I would say that that probably applies when it comes to ethics as well, though there are committees and there are boards that are looking from a standards perspective at whether there should be a minimum sort of ethics standards. And that will be informative to industry, I think.
I'll just, if I can add to that, you were mentioning that your technology is about recognizing soft skills and that sort of thing. So we had an organization pitch to us for our demos. So in-store demos, we have a really hard time getting consistency of the quality of how those demos are delivered and the interaction with customers. And this particular company would film the demonstrator, and be able to give live feedback because their technology was reading and giving advice. So then, we love that idea. We love to get consistency. We're very excited about it. But immediately our minds go to privacy. Our customers are walking around, they're getting filmed too. How are we going to deal with that? How are our actual employees who are doing the demos going to feel about it? So you got to also have a conversation about with the business leaders. And to your point, it is going to be the business leaders that have to make the decisions and be brave enough to drive change. And our lawyers always keep us out of jail. But
We're very proud of that.
Yeah. and we love you for it. Thank you. But they have to be able to have those conversations. So the discussion that we had around that is, how do you use that tool? So, instead of coming down on your people and saying you're doing everything wrong, and this is like, your leaders have to be able to use it as a teaching tool and as coaching and as guiding. So you need to be able to have both of those conversations and to get your business leaders on board.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for one more question?
Right on. A couple of,
Okay, who's first?
He probably has a better question. Okay. Are we living in a simulation?
Sorry?
Are we living in a simulation?
I think we'll go
I'm
to
a
the
business
next
leader, I don't
question.
know.
I think you have to ask Elon Musk that one.
Hi. Not as funny a question. Maria Trott. My question is to all three of you. What actual trainable skills that you think are going to be needed for this whole future that we're painting and talking about?
Well, we actually train people, so maybe I should start. Look, you still need the fundamental skills of in a business world, marketing, accounting, finance, strategy. Fundamentally, those sort of enduring fundamentals of management, I think, will endure. But I would say you're going to need more sort of initiative, risk-taking, and resilience. And certainly when I talk to employers, one of the things they tell me consistently is that they're now looking for those things when they're hiring people. And those are not the easiest things to evaluate. So employers are experimenting with different ways. And those go together in the sense that you've got initiative, you're willing to take some risk. Not everything is going to work out. And so you need to be able to fail quickly and manage that, and you need the resilience to deal with that. I think the other thing that is really going to be more important going forward than ever before. It's always been important, but it's going to, the pace of change is accelerating. One of the lines, I wish I knew who said it first, but the world is changing faster than it has ever changed in the history of humanity, and it will never change this slowly again. It's a bit of a terrifying thought. So, the traditional university model where you go to school for maybe 4 years or you go to grad school, add a few more, maybe it's 7 or 8 years, and then you take what you learned and you use that for the next 40 years of work. That's not going to work anymore. So there's going to have to be, people need to be curious. People need to continue learning. People need to keep reinvesting, staying on top of technology. If you look through time, say, 1,000 years ago, it took 4 generations before technology really changed the world very much. By 1900, it took about 1 generation. Today, it takes about 7 or 8 years. So, if the cycle's 7 or 8 years and it's only getting shorter, you're going to have to be able to keep refreshing. And that's a challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for society. Can society keep up with that rate of change?
I'll answer the question sort of in 2 parts. The first being, in terms of what we train, depends on the problem that we're trying to solve. So for example, in our warehouses, then we would be teaching and training on how to manage the robots and how to lead differently now that robots are involved in the business. In terms of my team, and you were talking about what business leaders are starting to look for in people. I talk to my team a lot about entrepreneurship, so acting as an entrepreneur within a very large organization. And one of the things I talk to my team about quite a lot is the ability to actually change your brain and your willingness to learn and your ability to adapt and your ability to stay on top of what's happening around you in the world. And I tell them, if you're not willing to learn and if you're blocked, then there's nothing we can do to help you and there's nothing you can do to sort of progress your career. But if you're determined to learn, then there's nothing that can stop you. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your career, no matter what you're doing, you should always be trying to learn. So as technology is advancing, as humanity is advancing, as everything's happening, you just have to have this thirst for learning. And if you don't, you're just going to get left behind. So as a business leader, I look for more of their the attitude, the fit within the organization, the ability to learn, the willingness to learn, how creative are you, how flexible are you, because there are technical skills that we can teach, there are fundamentals of the business that we can teach, but you're looking for that sort of fire inside of somebody.
So I'll talk about this from sort of an organizational perspective, which is I think that organizations need to, and I think your example is a great example because it's an example of an organization that saw the future 15 years ago and actually did something to change it, which I think is exactly where companies need to be. So the legal industry is often criticized for moving at a glacial pace. I make no comment, but let me just say that if we're going to survive as an industry, and we are not alone, that really it's about having a flexible work culture, and it's about recognizing that the systems, the actual sort of mechanism how things are, may have to change as well. So and I think you mentioned this, that it may just be, it's not just about, will the individual adapt, but it's, can the company sort of rethink itself and reorganize itself for a more flexible and a different, sort of a future that is valuing different skills.
Okay, so we're out of time, so I just want to wrap up and go, okay, so we're having a lot of change. We need leaders who've got the skills for not just the 21st century, but the 22nd century coming up, because that's coming up apparently faster than ever. We've got major infrastructure changes in many companies, which is going to require careful infrastructure and people management and leadership. And legal is also changing as we go on with these changes in the new industrial revolution. We're going to see a lot of more nuances in the law and many things that may have to change and that companies now have to address. So there is a lot of change going on there. So I'd like to thank the panel, Tiff, Nalika, and Carol, for an amazing and enlightening conversation. Thank you.